for, the budget and the finance, like how are we going to pay for all these things we want to do, is that people forget that a budget is essentially a plan in numbers, and so take your strategic plan, your big goals, what are the numbers that are going to need, you're going to need to support that. And so that may inform part of your implementation, right? Like, we know that we have this initiative that we really want to go after, but we know that the first step is that we have to get funding for it. So, that can inform, your timeline in terms of what action steps need to be taken.
Are you looking for ways to shorten your marketing learning curve and help your organization survive and thrive? Welcome to Relish This, the Purpose Marketing Podcast, a show for purpose-focused leaders who want to use marketing techniques to fuel their organization's growth. If you're a returning listener and you haven't subscribed already, we'd love to have you. Also, please consider leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Now here's your host, author and marketing specialist, Stu Swineford.
Hey everybody, Stu here. Every nonprofit needs a plan, and sometimes you just need a little help creating that plan. But really, if we are embarking on a journey with no real understanding of where we're going, it's going to be a real challenge to get there. And that's what my guest today, Carol Hamilton, does, is she helps nonprofits with strategic planning, leadership transitions, etc. And she is the principal of Grace Social Sector Consulting. Carol is super awesome. She has a lot of really great processes that she can help nonprofits deploy in order to make sure that they stay on track, as well as help them during those transition events that are really going to happen for every nonprofit. She has just a great capacity for understanding how people tend to fall into traps and how to get them out of those traps. And our conversation today was great. We really talked about all sorts of things. One of the best quotes you may have already heard is, "A budget is essentially a plan in numbers." I really think that there's a lot of fantastic information for any nonprofit out there to glean from our episode today, and hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. Here we go. Carol, how are you today?
Good. It's good to be on the podcast with you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for joining us on Relish This today. I'm very excited to talk with you about all of the good work that you're doing over at Grace Social Sector Consulting. I know you work with the nonprofit space and in helping them with strategic planning and leadership transitions and all of those great things. So I'm so excited to hear all about it.
Thank you so much.
Well, tell us a bit about how you got into the nonprofit space, how you've landed in this zone.
Yeah. Actually, relatively early in my career, my very first job out of college, I worked for a small company that actually helped people get on talk shows, and those were radio talk shows back in the day, and I'm sure they still do, and TV talk shows. But being a private company, they took all comers, and so I was helping publicize a whole range of ideas and perspectives, and some of them I definitely could get behind, and some of them I was like, I'm not so sure about this. So just having kind of learned that was something that I was pretty good at, just in terms of writing and managing kind of publications and stuff. I said, let me go do this for people and causes that I believe in. So that's how I got my start in the nonprofit sector. It also coincided with me moving back to Washington, D.C., where I'm from. So this is kind of nonprofit central, with many local organizations, of course, in the region, but also many national organizations that have their headquarters here. And so most of the organizations that I worked for over the course of my career before I went out on my own in terms of consulting were at the national level, and they were national. It was the national headquarters of those organizations. So
Yeah, DC is definitely the hotspot in terms of getting in front of those kinds of organizations. Yeah, and I would have to echo your thoughts there. It's really interesting how when you have great people to work with and for, how easy it is to get out of bed to do that work every day.
oh yeah, for sure. So I started out doing, a little bit more actually of the kind of work that you do, um, and I was probably one of those folks that you would help out because I just fell into marketing. I didn't really know much about it, and so I had to kind of teach myself. But over time, I just became more and more interested in, um, you know. How people were working together and how we could be
Hmm.
more effective in terms of moving the mission forward, and all the things that make organizations work. So that drew me to kind of move over to the organization development and strategy side of things, and kind of first step towards that was moving into professional development and
Right.
training and learning, and then into consulting. So
Yeah, that's great. So, what's your process? How do you start working with a new nonprofit to help them with their strategy?
yeah, so I mean, oftentimes I'm when I'm starting out with a group, we're working with a smaller group of people. It's oftentimes the executive director, the board chair. So the first step that I really have them take is to just put together a strategic planning committee, usually, or a task
Mhm.
force. And again, that is usually a pretty small group. But that's not the group that ends up doing the planning. And I think people get confused about that. They think that we set up a strategic planning committee and we kind of hand it off to them to do the plan. Well,
Mhm.
and when I'm working with groups, that group is really there to shepherd the process and help me, and help the plan move forward, to keep the everything moving forward, and make some key decisions along the way.
Mhm.
But then, the next step is to work with that group to have them think about their ecosystem. Who are those key stakeholders that they need to get input from, and then I'm oftentimes having conversations with those folks, whether it's through interviews, through a set of focus groups. I might be working with them to design a survey of different constituent groups to get input, and all of that kind of creates a baseline for those planning conversations where I can then take all that information that I've heard from so many different people,
Mhm.
and come together with it's really just like a snapshot of where the organization is at that moment. So, what are their strengths? What are their opportunities? What do people see for them in the future? And I present that as at the beginning of any kind of planning session, which is usually with a larger group of people. It could be the entire board and staff, depending on the size of the organization. It might be a subset of staff. But I really encourage groups to have have as many people as possible be part of those planning conversations, because the more that people are in the conversation, the more they recognize themselves in the final plan and the final decisions that get made, and the more committed they are to actually make those happen. And I think that's one of the things that trips organizations up, is that they're like, wow, that could be really unwieldy in terms of how many people are involved, and so how do we slim that down and kind of make it more manageable?
Mhm.
And it might feel more manageable, but what they lose out is that the buy-in that they're building through everyone being involved.
Gotcha. So you're trying to bring on as many stakeholders as possible within the organization to just make sure that everybody is is tracking and is on the same, in the same boat and kind of rowing the same direction, at least, as you're helping them develop that action plan.
Yeah, and so oftentimes the external stakeholders won't be a part of that planning meeting.
Hmm.
That'll be more internally focused, board and staff.
Hmm.
But through that process of those conversations, those focus groups, those surveys, you're getting input from from a broader perspective, from not just inside the organization but outside as well, and that can really help inform, how people realize how different people perceive the organization, and kind of what they see as their strengths and their core competencies, that kind of thing.
Right, right. That's just really cool way to make sure that you have buy-in kind of throughout the process, and it's not you're surprising a bunch of people at the end with, well, here's what we figured out, and away you go. It sounds like it really creates buy-in throughout
Well, yeah, and
the engagement.
that's the purpose and the design. Yeah, because I've seen too many organizations where I think, in a more traditional model, and old, kind of older thinking about governance, there was a very, very bright line between the board is all about strategy, the staff is about implementation. But the
Mhm.
truth is that, the board brings a variety of perspectives, but the staffs are the people who are doing the things day to day. And so
Mhm.
you really need both of them in the conversation. And so, if you just have the board create the strategy without any meaningful engagement of staff, and then it's kind of handed down to staff, sure, people will do, it's their job, they'll do it, but they may not have the same commitment that if they'd been in the conversation,
Mhm.
the same decisions and goals might end up being created. But just having been part of the conversation, seeing how the conversation kind of emerges, how those decisions get made, I think, folks just naturally are more ready to say, okay, let's get to work and make this happen. Because I think the big fear, that one of the big fears that people have when they do strategic planning is that, it'll just be something that gets left on the shelf. It doesn't, we've spent a lot of time and energy doing something, and we didn't end up actually following the plan or doing much with it. And I think the more that it's kind of top down, and there are only a few people involved, the more you increase the likelihood, unfortunately, of that happening.
Right. Of having taken all this time and energy and investment and just had it be something that a box that you ticked as opposed to something that you actually execute
Right,
upon.
right, right.
What are some of the other pitfalls that people um, can can avoid if they if they're aware of them and ready to move beyond those challenges?
Yeah, so when I'm working with groups and I, take them through those, and nowadays we're doing them all online, so it's a series of sessions instead of
Mhm.
like a day-long retreat or a day and a half retreat, which I'm really seeing as kind of valuable. And we can talk about that in a little bit. But just in terms of those pitfalls, once you end up with those big goals, okay, we've got, our three, no more than five big goals that we're going to be pursuing over the next couple years. We've identified action steps, we've identified a success criteria. I think, groups can trip themselves up when they try to get too, tied up in the details. I really encourage groups to just focus on that bigger picture plan for that longer time period, 3 to 5 years, and then to take that and to say, okay, this is our year one implementation plan. And that's where you really get down into the nitty gritty of, the SMART goals of, we're going to do this by X time, and so is responsible for it, et cetera. And coupled with that, to have a review process. Okay, we're going to check in with this at 6 months, a year, see how we're doing. Also see not just progress, but like maybe we need to make some tweaks. Um, so I think when groups can get caught up in trying to decide who's going to do what in year three, and I feel like that's just a waste of time and energy. Like, you don't know
Right.
what's going to be into, who's going to be there, how far you will have gotten, any of those things. So, you know, for the operationalizing of the plan, for that implementation plan, just do it in at most 1 year chunks,
Hmm.
and really get into the details there. So I think that um, that also mitigates another pitfall, which is, to have that kind of big plan that then doesn't get operationalized, that doesn't somehow is kind of over in some other category, doesn't fit into how you do your regular planning, how you do your budgeting, how you do your staffing for forecasting. So making sure that there's a connection between those two things, and build in have figuring a way to bring the strategic plan into all of those regular parts of your operation so that you really
Yeah.
do operationalize it. So those are a couple, I think, that are key. Making sure you have the right people and not the a large group of people involved in different ways at the beginning, not trying to decide exactly what you're doing in year 3, and then
Right.
failing to operationalize the plan. Those are a couple biggies.
Yeah, it sounds like there's sort of a standardization component that is required to make sure that you have success, where you've created processes and those are kind of normalized, I guess, within the organization, as opposed to trying to change everything at once. Is that what I'm hearing a little bit?
Right, or making sure that you're linking the two so that
Hmm.
your strategy and then those operational things are connected. So I think one of the things, most I was actually talking to a finance person on my podcast last week, and I think one of the big disconnects, for the budget and the finance, like how are we going to pay for all these things we want to do, is that people forget that a budget is essentially a plan in numbers.
Right. I love that.
And so take your strategic plan, your big goals, what are the numbers that are going to need you're going to need to support that? And so that may inform part of your implementation, right? Like, we know that we have this initiative that we really want to go after, but we know that the first step is that we have to get funding for it. So that can inform your timeline in terms of what action steps need to be taken.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to think about it. Excuse me. In terms of like all of the planning that you put together is just another way to look at how to execute on that. So when you have a budget, that's just essentially, um, a way to look at the plan, and where you see bigger numbers, that may be where there is additional effort or additional stuff that needs to be done in order to get that completed. I like that kind of shift in mentality, because I think people kind of look at numbers, or they look at these things as not part of the overall methodology to how we're going to get from point A to point B.
Right. And I mean, for most nonprofit organizations, their biggest line item is their people,
Hmm.
all the investment that they're making in people. So that may be one big lump number, but it's going to represent a whole bunch of different activities or programs that the organization is pursuing. And so, helping people understand the connection between those two. And
Hmm.
again, in strategic planning, like, we want to start this new program, or we see this new opportunity, you know ultimately in that implementation plan, what's going to be needed in terms of staffing to support that. Where are you in terms of capacity? I mean, I think another pitfall is when the plan is just all pie in the sky and doesn't at all recognize what's already on people's plates, and just thinks that you're going to pile more and more on top. And most folks are pretty maxed out. We certainly know over the last couple of years, there's just been so much talk about burnout in the sector. And so, one thing that unfortunately organizations often aren't as good at is through that process deciding what they're not going to do, or what they're not going to do anymore, to make room for something new. if it's not just we're gonna find new staff to do this new thing.
Right. Yeah, that's actually a good point in terms of planning, is also taking a look at all of the things that we're going to stop doing. Um, I actually just went through my 1 year plan. I try and do that on a weekly basis, is take a look at how what I thought I was going to do starting the first of the year. And one of the sections that has been pretty effective for me is, what are you going to continue to do and what are you going to stop doing?
Yeah, yeah. One
And
one of the exercises I
yeah,
love doing with people is that, and I'm borrowing it from someone else, and I don't know who created it, but the stop, start, continue, right? Like what do we want to continue doing? What do we want to start doing? And what do we want to stop doing? And yeah, oftentimes if that's a real issue, like that may come up in that first part where, when I'm talking to everyone and they're like, we have no space to think strategically because we are so overloaded.
yeah,
And so it might be that at that point, with that kind of information about where the organization is, that they need to do something different than a strategic plan, right? They might need to do something that I call a strategic portfolio review, where they actually look at everything they're doing, come up with some criteria of, there's some criteria that you can really measure, like what's its impact, and then also look at the financial impact of each of those activities. And there's a way to kind of map it out of, the things, and the classic consultant two axis matrix thing, where you've got in one corner you've got your things that are really mission aligned, and they also are positive in terms of financial impact on the organization. And then
hmm
to the opposite of those things that are not that mission aligned and actually are costing the organization money. And they may be things that were in the past, things that really, um, were really relevant a couple years ago, but just aren't as relevant, or not as many people are coming. And so, if it's a fee for service kind of thing, attendance has dropped. And so, it's now costing the organization money. And then even the things that are designed as fundraisers, are they actually making money for your organization? And I'm not a
hmm
fundraising person, so just that caveat. But you can take a look to say two things, like how can you make your gala or whatever kind of event you might have that many organizations have, how can you pull that more closely into your mission, and really use it as an opportunity to educate people about what you're doing and get them excited about your mission. And
right,
also, how can you manage costs so that you're really actually, um, it actually is a fundraiser,
right,
instead of
right.
just a break evener,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Or a nice event. So yeah, so that's a process that really helps groups look at what they've got going on right now and help them make some decisions about what they might let go of and what they want to invest more in and grow, because it's the thing that's really um, both clearly aligned to mission, but also healthy in terms of a financial sustainability point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. And really looking at both the kind of direct and indirect benefits of those types of events. I know galas
Direct and the
are,
indirect cost of those events. I
yeah,
think that's so easy for people to think about. And this is in the before times when events where you were dealing with food and napkins and catering and locations and all of that. But people are very good at keeping track of all those direct costs, but they forget to do any kind of or can forget to really take a look at how much time and energy
mhm.
is this taking from staff, from volunteers, and is there a balance between those?
Yeah, and not just the big number that comes in at the end of the night, which is always exciting, but just making sure that that big number is also, um, not only profitable on a nightly component or standpoint, but also looking at the excitement that's generated and trying to measure that as well, because there's
Right.
certainly that kind of long term, somewhat intangible that is a benefit. I do know that people get pretty excited about in-person gala events and things of that nature, and they certainly are a lot of fun. But just making sure that we're looking at all of the pieces of that puzzle.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that kind of process is, well, again, I'm not a fundraising person, but like, golf tournaments used to be super popular,
Mm-hmm.
right? And as a fundraiser, and certainly it can be a fun event. But when you look at how is this aligned with our mission, for most organization, there's not going to be much alignment. So, how can you create your events in a way that also support moving the mission forward?
Yeah, absolutely. You're creating alignment in all of those aspects, and we talk a lot about partnership alignment as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like nonprofits a lot of times have people coming in offering kind of sponsorship money or sort of talking about partnership opportunities, and those have the biggest positive effect when they hit on a variety of different levels. So when you do get, an infusion of cash, that's amazing. But when that infusion of cash can also be tied to, some kind of mission alignment piece, where it's not just a company coming in trying to greenwash something or take care of a PR problem, but making sure that things are aligned, that the audiences are aligned, then you get the most benefit out of those engagements and those those true partnership opportunities. They're not just a sponsorship; it's a two-way street. That's when those things really start to shine.
Oh yeah, yeah, and just to be also, cognizant of what else is is that potential partner doing, and are they helping or hindering our mission? If they're working against your mission and yet they're giving you money, that's really not gonna help you that much in the long term, even though it
Yeah,
will help you in the short term.
yeah, for sure. It's something to just keep in the back of one's mind when you're starting to have those conversations and really get into the into the details. Just making sure that there's good solid alignment there is certainly something to consider.
Yeah, and I actually, one of the things that I like to make sure that the groups that I work with also have, when we're done, not only a plan, but something I call a strategy screen. I didn't actually call it that. It was dubbed by La Piana Consulting, and I borrowed their methodology. But it's basically a way to, again, it's kind of separating, setting the criteria, setting how you're going to make a decision from the
Mhm.
decision itself. So, um, having the group brainstorm what are all the criteria that they would want to use to make a decision about some kind of strategic thing that pops up as an opportunity or as a challenge, because inevitably as soon as you're done with a plan, something else is going to pop up, right?
Oh, absolutely.
If
Yeah.
the last few years haven't taught us that, I don't know what will. Um and so this will be things like, alignment with our mission, impact on reputation or brand, moving our advocacy agenda forward, let's say. I mean, it's going to depend on the organization, what exactly those criteria are, and then creating essentially like a rubric of, you know 1 to 4. 1 is there's no alignment at all. 4, there's like the most alignment you could possibly have,
Hmm.
and kind of qualifying each of those criteria. But then by having that tool, something like that partnership opportunity that you're talking about, you might have someone who's super enthusiastic on your board, who's bringing it forward, who this is built on a relationship that they have, and so without that tool, it becomes about that, right? It becomes about that person's enthusiasm, their relationships, all the things that
Right.
they see as benefits, and being able to have a tool that you've already built before you're having that conversation helps, helps have a more consistent process, but also helps kind of depersonalize it and okay, these are just the things that we use to be able to make that decision. So it mitigates a little bit that tendency of groups to follow the most eloquent person, the most persuasive, the most influential, and lets them have a little bit more of um, an even-handed conversation, if you will, about the pros and cons of any kind of opportunity or challenge that pops up.
Yeah, I think that's great. Creating opportunities to just slow things down a little bit and
Mm-hmm.
be more thoughtful. It's something I've been working on quite a bit personally. I tend to suffer from that Chinese squirrel syndrome challenge myself, and so I think having a system and a process in place to address those items as they arise, give yourself the opportunity to act quickly on things that are very, that do pass that initial test. So have some flexibility, because there may be things that that either happen or opportunities that do come across one's path on which you want to be able to be um, flexible and able to move quickly. However, if everything it falls into that category, then all of a sudden you don't have a plan anymore. You're just reacting. So I think that's great. What are some of the other tools? I know nonprofits, everybody gets really excited about tools. What are some of the other tools that you have developed or found over the years that you see as a huge benefit for kind of this strategy process?
Yeah. So, well, I think a strategic plan itself, and having the discipline to have it be a couple pages, not a tome,
Mm-hmm.
is important, because I think again, you know, the planning process, when you say strategic planning and people start to groan, I think it's mostly because they've been in processes where they've ended up with something like that, and it's so big and complicated that no one ever looks at it again. So just keeping the plan pretty high level, but also like defining what you think are defining how you're going to measure success.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be literally in terms of metrics and measurement. That could be progress. Like, how are you going to know that you've succeeded or made progress on this particular goal or these particular actions? So it's part of in how you structure the plan, and then the process, more than a tool, that you use to continue to come back to it, see where we are, see what needs to be adjusted. Because I think the other thing that people kind of get caught up in is like, well, this is our plan and we can't change it. Well, no, I
Yeah.
mean, it was a plan made at a particular time with a particular group of people, and hopefully it's in a Word document or a Google Doc. Like, you can edit it. It can change.
Right. Right.
Not to be changing every minute, because then you're just you're all over the place, and nobody knows what's going on. But not to get stuck in this idea that it's unchangeable. Um, we've talked about the strategic portfolio review, so really taking a look at all the things the organization is doing at that time, and what value they're bringing, and what might need to be let go of, and that can go happen in a couple different ways, because I think that's the hardest thing really, is for it's so hard for groups to stop doing something that they've always done. But it could be that there's another group that could take over a program that they're more well positioned for that, and connecting with the community that you no longer do, or something. Or it could morph from, it's the original intent of this program or thing was to be a fundraising event, and it's not actually raising money anymore, but
Right.
it does bring value to important constituency. So how can you change it so that you meet the need for those important constituents without assuming that it's going to raise money for you? Like, so how could
Mm-hmm.
you change it to lower costs, but still really be important to those folks? So it's sometimes it's just saying, no, we're not going to do this anymore. and sometimes it's thinking about those things in a different way.
Right.
And then the strategy screen, I think, is super helpful. So those are a couple things that I'd like to work with groups on to help them build them. And then I think
Nice.
another one is mapping your impact. So sometimes people will call this a theory of change, but and they can be very sophisticated. They can also be relatively simple. Of just what's our end goal? What are we trying to do? And then what are the steps that are going to take to get there? And mapping out what you're currently doing and asking the question, you know, what are all the assumptions that we have about what we're doing? So a lot of times, let's make this more realistic. Let's say an environmental group. Oftentimes they'll have some component of environmental education, and
Mhm.
oftentimes they're doing that with youth. And their ultimate mission is to have those people become advocates for the environment. But there are a lot of steps from having people go, and it could be a recreation thing, go kayak on the river, or
Mhm.
do a cleanup on, Earth Day or whatnot, to them actually, um, you know, writing a letter to their representative around some advocacy issue. And
Mhm.
so by mapping out that impact, you can question whether the actions you're taking are actually ending up with the result that you're hoping for. And if not, what can you put in between to really help people move from that cleanup to that advocacy role? And what other supports do they need to kind of help them move along that path?
Right. So you're making assumptions that somebody that you take out on the river is going to, eventually write a letter or donate or whatever the end thing is that you want them
Hmm.
to do.
Hmm.
But really making sure that all of the steps are aligned toward that goal, where you're taking those actions along the way to make sure that they're taking those steps, that they're actually moving down that path.
Yeah, and it's likely going to be a subset of those folks, right?
Right.
But it might be, thinking about that recreation event. And if you're only thinking of it as a recreation event, then, first you're giving everyone the safeties talk at the beginning. But
Yep.
what ways are there for you to start, actually educating people and raising their awareness about the issues and about how they might actually be able to affect change?
Yeah.
Um,
And are you letting people just leave at the end of the day,
right.
or is there a final kind of wrap up where you say, hey, we'd also like you to take this action, or come back to participate on another project or whatever the thing is.
Right.
Um,
Right.
just making sure you have that process in place,
Right,
which I
and
know
thinking,
that a
yeah,
lot of
kinda
people
thinking
don't.
it through, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think for people who are in it, that next step is really obvious, but for
Hmm.
people that you're just introducing, it's not.
Yeah, for sure. So, what are some of the things that I know that you work with kind of, um, when there's a leadership change at a nonprofit? I know that that's something else that you help with. What are some of the things that you would recommend nonprofits keep in mind as they are going through a leadership change?
Yeah. Um, I think, again, in that process, you're gonna go through a similar what when you're doing it well, and, ideally working with either a consultant, with a search firm, whoever you're working with to kind of support that process. um, is that you're taking that time to do an assessment of where the organization is. So that's kind of the first step of a strategic plan, but it's also helpful, really important when you're going through that leadership transition. Usually, when I'm doing that with groups, the time frame is a little shorter. I'm actually they may the leaving executive director may sometimes will come to me wanting to do a strategic plan and then happen to mention, oh, but I'm retiring in a year. And I'll say, well, actually, let's back that up. Let's do an organizational assessment. Let's yes, you want to leave a plan and a solid foundation for the new person, but you also want to leave, let them then embark on a strategic planning process, once they're have got a
Right.
solid footing so that it's their plan and not yours. So oftentimes you're planning out maybe a year and a half, just so you have the first 6 months of the new person kind of mapped out. Depending on what's found in that organizational assessment, it may make sense for a group to have an interim executive director come in
Hmm.
and help clean up some if there are problems. If the person leaves suddenly, that may help not have everyone feel the urgency of, oh my god, we just have to get a body in there. That's always a bad place to be when you're hiring.
Hmm.
um, to help the board go through a process so that they really think about what do they need next. What have they really appreciated about the current executive director, but what do they need in their next phase? And depending on, there are different kinds of transitions. One that I worked with recently, the person was particularly beloved and had been there for quite a while, so she really had an imprint on the organizational culture, the expectations around board, and their, how they work together, her particular leadership style. So part of the work with that board was just helping them recognize that that is one leadership style and the next person will probably have a different one, and just kind of be mentally and emotionally ready to accept a different way of interacting with a new executive director. So I think helping people just to realize that there are a lot of emotions that go through transitions. I think,
Hmm.
when we think, certainly in our culture, we like to pretend that we leave our emotions at the door at work, and of course that's not true. And so just normalizing that transitions, there's some anxiety, there's some fear, there may be there's probably some excitement. It's all there. It's one day it's like fear and dread, and the next day it's excitement. You just don't know where you're going to be on that roller coaster.
Right.
So yeah, so those are some of the things. I mean, groups can get started on succession planning. I think it's one of those things that's hard to prioritize because but very important. It's one of those important but not urgent, or for most groups.
Sure. Right. Right.
Um, but even especially with long-term founders or long-term executive directors, just remembering, they're not going to be with the organization forever. Nobody
Hmm.
is. And so how can you start preparing, setting up processes so what the steps are going to be when you need to start working on it. um, and how can you start cultivating leadership within your organization, so things are not all on one person. Starting to do some cross training. What documentation do you have? Do you have any of your systems documented, or is all
Hmm.
the information in this person's head? Those kinds of things. We actually did this in our family. My brother is developmentally disabled, and we realized as siblings that we're gonna have to take over, right? When our parents could no longer handle
Right.
everything. And of course, they've been doing that for so long. And I feel like this is such a parallel to a lot of long term executives. And we're in that phase where so many long term executives are now retiring, and these leadership transitions are happening more and more. And we actually, the first instinct is like, well, just go ahead and write everything down so we can know it. Well, they didn't even know where to start, because they've been
Right.
doing this
Right.
for so long. It was so natural, so they'd forgotten half of it. So we actually split up all the areas that we needed to know about. And luckily, I have several siblings, and my daughter helped out too. And we interviewed them about each of those. So I can't remember, I think it was the health history. My other one sister interviewed about the finances, another one interviewed about the organization that supports him. So we kind of split up all the different categories
Hmm.
and did these interviews to actually kind of get that knowledge download. And it was amazing how well it worked, because I just know that if we hadn't done that, there would have been so much knowledge that we'd lost, when they passed. And just for a very practical thing, we needed to be able to take care of my brother. And so how
Sure.
do you take care of the organization, and how do you help people do that kind of knowledge transfer? It's such a challenge, I think, in organizations, especially when everyone's moving so fast and got so much on their
Yeah.
plate.
Well, and everything has to happen today, right? You start to feel like, well, I don't have time to document because it's going to take me, twice as long to write it down than to just get it done.
Right, right,
Um, but really making sure that you carve out a little bit of time, every day or every week, and coming up with a plan for that, I think is part of the process.
right. It's part
What
of
are
that
the
whole succession planning is
Yeah,
how are
what
you
are
going to
the
document it?
what are those buckets that people should be kind of considering?
Well, I think one of them is actually getting a realistic kind of first, just starting with what does the executive director do, and then taking a look at that and thinking about is this a sustainable job, or is this the job of several people? Because
Mhm.
oftentimes, and or what are the things that the executive director is doing currently that matches really well with their strengths and their interests, but isn't 100% necessary for the next leader to do.
Okay.
So it's kind of, again, decoupling, because I mean, ideally, when someone's been in a role, it starts to, the organization finds a way to really magnify their strengths, and so they have them doing those things, right?
Mhm.
But it doesn't mean that every person who's ever in that role is going to need to do exactly the same things. So
Yeah.
really starting with that job description, documenting what that person is doing. And this could be, in terms of those interviews, like, well, what's a day in the life? What's a week in the life, which is more likely, right? Because most folks, their jobs are not the same every day. To get a sense of what are all the different things that they're doing, and then to start to ask the question of, is this absolutely necessary to be in this role?
Right. Right.
Um,
Because I bet there are a lot of activities that all of us do on any given day that are not really very aligned with the role that we serve for our organizations.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of times, especially in smaller organizations, you'll find that everybody reports to the executive director. Well, is
Right.
that necessary? Are they a good manager? Do they have time to manage? Is that what you want them focused on, or would it be better for the organization to create a deputy or a COO role,
Hmm.
chief of staff role that really is internally focused to allow the executive director to be much more externally focused? So just starting to ask those questions of, um, I was talking to somebody, and they described how they wrote all the grant applications. Well, it was a small organization, so somebody had to do it. But did it have
Right.
to be the executive director? Probably not.
Right.
So just looking at those things, I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah, it's great. I was involved with an organization last year that had an executive director transition, and I think that I mean there were a few things that I believe took everybody by surprise, and one was just how challenging it was to find the right fit for the organization, and so how long the actual search took. We just did not. I don't think that we had any um, real strong understanding of how long it was going to take to actually get the right person in to fill that position. And certainly having done a little planning prior to would have been, I think beneficial.
Yeah, and I think, especially for board search committees, when it does take a lot longer than they expected, they're volunteers. They're probably worn out by the end of that process. So another piece that gets lost is really planning for that onboarding process for the new person. How are they going to be supported? How are they going to get up to speed? How are they going to, most importantly, really get connected to all of the important relationships for the organization? And as more and more organizations are really wanting to center equity in their search processes, um, you know, questioning what is that right fit? Like, does the person have to have been an executive director before? I mean, we
Right.
know that. the field has been very white dominated. Most people in the executive director realm, boards are often high percentage white. And so if you are prioritizing wanting to recruit some person of color, they may not have had the opportunity to be an executive director before. So what are other roles that could, what are really the skills that you need for that role versus the titles and experience too? And then what are they walking into, and what support are they going to have as they to succeed?
Right.
So that I think a mistake that organizations can make is to think it's just about the recruitment process and forget that their culture may not be supportive and may be very white dominant in a way that they're not cognizant of. So those are some other
Right.
things that groups need to be aware of as well.
Yeah, so many things.
Yes.
It's good to have someone like you who has kind of walked through all of this more than once to help people understand all of the pieces and help guide them in all of the challenges that every nonprofit is actually either going through or will probably go through at some point or another.
Right. Yeah. So having that guide along the side, I think, is very helpful.
Yeah, for sure. So I know you have a podcast. I know that you also have a website. What are some ways that people can find you and follow you and learn more about how to more effectively run their nonprofits?
Sure. So the podcast that I host is called Mission Impact. You can find that in pretty much any podcast hosting place that you go listen to your podcast. So if you're a podcast listener, which you are, if you're listening to this conversation, find me at Mission Impact. Otherwise, you can find me at gracesocialsector.com, and love to hear from folks.
Well, thank you so much. I love having conversations and talking about things, but I also want to inspire action. One of my parts of my declaration is that I am unbridled action. And so helping people figure out what they can do after listening to a show is something that I'm really interested in. If you had somebody listen to the show and have some takeaways, what would you have them do after listening to our show?
Yeah, I think the thing that I would have them do would be to have a conversation with whatever group is in charge of making important decisions for the organization, senior staff, board, and have that conversation about what are the key criteria that we need to think about when we're thinking about a decision. I think that you can have a pretty short conversation and come up with a list and come up with a way to use that as a screen for your important decisions. So I think that, and I think it's also like, what's the next good action, and not get so worried about best and right, so that you can keep momentum, keep moving forward.
I love it. That's a really great way to reframe things. I think we all have a tendency to seek out perfect, and at some point, perfect is the enemy of done.
Yes.
So getting things to good enough is
Good enough.
pretty important, and then iterating.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
thank you so much for being on the show today. I had such a good time talking with you, Carol, as always, and I look forward to hearing what's next for you.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks for being on.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
And there you have it, another great episode of Relish This. Thanks again for listening. You can find past episodes of the show at relishthis.org. And remember, if you liked what you heard today, please subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. For more information on purpose marketing, grab your free copy of my book, Mission Uncomfortable: How Nonprofits Can Embrace Purpose-Driven Marketing to Survive and Thrive. Get your copy now at missionuncomfortablebook.com. Thanks again for listening. Come back next week, won't you?